Jacob Turner, a decorated veteran, faces racial prejudice from Victoria Hayes during a first-class flight. Despite her entitled behavior, Jacob remains calm, earning the attention of Michael Carter, a nonprofit leader. Victoria's actions are caught on video, which goes viral, leading to her professional downfall. Seeking redemption, Victoria apologizes to Jacob, who agrees to mentor her in addressing her biases. Together, they embark on a journey of growth, speaking at events to inspire change. Their unlikely partnership transforms a moment of conflict into a movement of hope, emphasizing the power of forgiveness, accountability, and personal transformation. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's enjoy. Jacob Turner stood in the crowded airport terminal, his senses alert despite the exhaustion that clung to him like a heavy cloak. He'd lost track of how many hours he had been awake. His last deployment overseas had been grueling, and the memories of endless nights under foreign skies lingered. Still, this was the moment he had been waiting for, a long-awaited flight home, a rare first-class ticket in hand, and the thought of his wife and daughter waiting at the end of the journey. Jacob adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, its weight a reminder of all he had left behind and all he was about to return to. He had always been practical, not one to indulge in luxuries, but after years of putting everyone else first, he had convinced himself that this first-class flight was earned. A small luxury for a man who had given so much to his country. The airport was its usual rush of bodies and sounds. Travelers hustled past him, their faces a blur of exhaustion, excitement, or frustration. Jacob moved through the terminal with practiced ease, blending in despite the crisp, pressed uniform that marked him as different. A few people glanced at him, offering tired but respectful nods. He acknowledged them with polite but minimal gestures. He had never been one for the spotlight, even though his service had often placed him at its center. As he made his way toward the check-in counter, his thoughts shifted to Grace, his wife. She had been his rock through countless deployments, holding down the fort at home while he was away. And then there was Chloe, his 8-year-old daughter, who had grown more independent with each passing year. Every time he came home, she seemed older, her innocence slipping away with the realities of the world. That was the hardest part, missing out on the little moments that couldn't be recaptured. He was determined to make up for it now, even if he had no idea how to start. His fingers tightened around the first-class ticket, a physical reminder of the small joy he had allowed himself. The last time he'd flown home, it had been crammed in coach, stuck between two business travelers who barely noticed his existence. This time, it would be different. He'd have space to breathe, to reflect, to prepare for the final leg of his journey home. Jacob arrived at the first-class lounge, a serene oasis compared to the chaos outside. He handed over his boarding pass, receiving a warm smile from the attendant. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice soft and respectful. He nodded, offering a small smile in return. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the gestures of gratitude. It was just that they always felt unnecessary. Jacob wasn't in it for the recognition. He had done his duty, like many before him, and many still to come. The lounge was filled with the quiet murmur of conversations, business people tapping away on laptops, and a few couples sipping drinks by the windows. Jacob found an empty seat near the corner, setting his bag down and taking a deep breath. This was the first time in a long while that he could just sit and exist without a mission hanging over his head. As he scanned the room, his gaze landed on a woman seated near the window. She was hard to miss. Dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, she exuded an air of privilege and authority. Her polished appearance was in stark contrast to his own tired, weathered look. For a moment, their eyes met, and her expression flickered with something Jacob couldn't quite place. Curiosity? Disdain? It was brief, but noticeable. He averted his eyes, unwilling to engage in whatever assumptions she might be making about him. He had dealt with enough judgment in his life to know when someone was making an assumption based on appearances alone. Victoria Hayes, he would learn later, was a name he would never forget. Boarding began for first class, and Jacob rose, feeling the familiar stiffness in his muscles from years of hard service. As he approached the gate, he once again caught sight of the woman from the lounge. Victoria Hayes was already in line, standing with an air of impatience, her designer handbag perched on her shoulder like a badge of honor. He noticed the way she glanced at him again as he approached, this time with less subtlety. He reached the gate agent, handing over his ticket. The agent gave him a polite nod and directed him toward the jet bridge. "Thank you for your service," the agent said softly, echoing the sentiment he'd heard 1,000 times before. Jacob returned the nod, his mind already focused on the thought of settling into his seat and escaping the constant tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As Jacob made his way down the aisle to the first-class section, he noticed Victoria again. She was already seated, adjusting her handbag on the seat beside her. When he reached his assigned seat next to her, the tension became palpable. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she scanned him from head to toe, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Excuse me," Jacob said politely, gesturing toward the seat next to hers. "I believe this is my seat." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked him over again, her gaze lingering on his uniform as if trying to piece together how someone like him could afford a first-class ticket. Her silence was deafening, the disdain in her expression unmistakable. Finally, she spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is first class." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. He had dealt with worse than entitled passengers during his time in the military, but there was something about this interaction that struck a nerve. "Yes, I'm sure," Jacob replied, holding up his boarding pass. "This is my seat." Victoria's eyes flicked to his boarding pass, then back to his face, still unconvinced. "I find that hard to believe," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for him to hear. Jacob took a deep breath, reminding himself that this was not a battle worth fighting. He had survived far worse than a woman questioning his right to be here. Without another word, he placed his duffel in the overhead bin and settled into his seat beside her. Victoria's posture stiffened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unhappy with the seating arrangement. Jacob could feel the weight of her disapproval, but he forced himself to remain calm. He was too close to home to let someone like Victoria ruin his day. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension between Jacob and Victoria continued to simmer. She kept stealing glances at him, her irritation growing more palpable with every passing minute. Jacob tried to focus on the thought of home, on seeing Grace and Chloe after months away, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being judged. Eventually, Victoria couldn't hold back any longer. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few nearby passengers. "But are you absolutely certain you're supposed to be here? It just doesn't seem likely." Jacob turned his head slowly to look at her, the calm he had maintained so far beginning to fray. He didn't want to make a scene, but the disrespect was undeniable. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on them, their unease growing with every word Victoria uttered. Before Jacob could respond, a flight attendant appeared at their row, sensing the rising tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. Victoria was quick to speak up, her voice indignant. "I think there's been a mistake. This man seems to think he's supposed to be sitting here, but I find that hard to believe." Jacob remained silent, handing his boarding pass to the flight attendant without a word. The attendant examined it briefly before giving him a respectful nod. "There's no mistake, ma'am. This is Mr. Turner's seat." Victoria blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting that response. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "Well, I just find that very unusual," she muttered, her voice laced with annoyance. The flight attendant offered a tight smile, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. "Everything is in order, ma'am. Mr. Turner, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Jacob nodded, grateful for the intervention, but still feeling the weight of the encounter. As the flight attendant walked away, Victoria crossed her arms and huffed, turning her body slightly away from him as if to shield herself from his presence. Jacob exhaled slowly, trying to push the interaction from his mind. He had dealt with people like Victoria before, people who judged others based on nothing more than their appearance or circumstances. But it didn't make it any easier to swallow. All he wanted was a peaceful flight home, but it seemed that even this small luxury came with its own challenges. He glanced out the window, focusing on the thought of home. Soon, he told himself. Soon he would be with his family, and this moment would be nothing more than a passing memory. Jacob leaned back in his seat, staring out of the small airplane window. The engine's steady hum should have been soothing, but his thoughts were a tangled mess of frustration and exhaustion. He had been home for less than a day, and already the familiar stings of prejudice had resurfaced. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, Victoria's snide comments and hostile attitude kept creeping back into his mind. He had been taught, both by his parents and the military, to pick his battles carefully. This one was clearly not worth fighting, at least not in the traditional sense. Jacob didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to draw more attention to himself, but sitting silently while someone questioned his right to be in first class based on how he looked. That was harder than any of the battles he'd fought overseas. The flight attendant, a young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, glanced nervously between him and Victoria. She had already diffused the situation once, but it was clear that Victoria wasn't finished. Victoria sighed loudly, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the armrest, her annoyance impossible to ignore. "I just don't understand why they let anyone in first class these days," she muttered, her voice low but loud enough for Jacob and the surrounding passengers to hear. Jacob clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, could sense their discomfort, their unwillingness to intervene. This was a scene they had probably seen before, in airports, restaurants, or stores. The kind of subtle, insidious racism that often went unchecked. Before Jacob could decide how to react, the flight attendant returned. This time, there was a nervous tension in her voice as she asked, "Is everything okay here? I noticed a bit of discomfort earlier." Victoria seized the opportunity, sitting up straight and fixing her eyes on the young woman. "Discomfort? You could say that. This man here thinks he belongs in first class, but I find that hard to believe. There's been a mistake." The flight attendant glanced at Jacob, her cheeks flushing slightly as if embarrassed for him. Jacob remained silent, watching her carefully. She looked back down at the boarding pass she had already verified earlier, but now seemed more uncertain. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. "But there's no mistake. Mr. Turner has a valid first-class ticket. Everything is in order." Victoria blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just think it's highly unlikely that someone like him could afford a first-class ticket," she said, not even attempting to hide the venom in her voice. Jacob inhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. It wasn't that he hadn't faced this kind of prejudice before. He had. But the way Victoria seemed so certain of her superiority, so convinced that she was right to question his place, was something that struck a deep, painful chord. He thought of his daughter, Chloe, and how he wanted to protect her from people like Victoria, from a world that would one day try to judge her the same way it judged him. The flight attendant stood her ground, her voice tightening as she replied, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop this now. If you continue to harass Mr. Turner, I'll have to escalate this to the captain. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior on board." Victoria's eyes widened, clearly taken aback by the firm response. She opened her mouth to argue further, but seemed to think better of it. With an exasperated sigh, she turned away, crossing her arms and sinking back into her seat, glaring at the seat in front of her. The flight attendant offered Jacob a small, apologetic smile before turning and walking back down the aisle, her posture stiff with the effort of maintaining her professionalism. Jacob let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension begin to ease from his shoulders. The confrontation had been settled for now, but the sting of Victoria's words still lingered. He wasn't angry exactly. He had been through too much in life to let someone like Victoria rattle him. But there was a deep sadness that came with knowing that, no matter how hard he worked or how much he gave, people like her would always see him as less than that. The rest of the flight passed in strained silence. Victoria didn't speak to him again, but Jacob could feel her presence beside him like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the biases that still existed, even in places as seemingly ordinary as an airplane. Jacob stared out of the airplane window, the clouds rolling by below them in soft white waves. His mind wandered back to his last deployment, the long nights on patrol, the friends he had lost, and the weight of the decisions he had been forced to make. The military had given him a sense of purpose, a reason to push forward, but it had also taken its toll. He had seen the world at its worst, had witnessed the kind of cruelty and devastation that most people only read about in newspapers or saw in movies. And yet somehow sitting next to Victoria, enduring her thinly veiled insults and condescension, felt just as exhausting as any battlefield. Jacob thought of Grace, his wife, who had been by his side through every deployment, every long separation. She had never once complained, never once made him feel guilty for choosing a life that kept him away from home. And Chloe, his daughter, who had been so small when he first left for his tours, was now a young girl full of questions about the world. Grace always told him that the world was changing, that people were becoming more aware of the challenges faced by minorities. But moments like this, when he was judged simply for existing in a place someone else didn't think he belonged, made him question just how much things had really changed. He had spent years serving his country, risking his life for the freedoms that people like Victoria took for granted. And yet here he was, being treated like a second-class citizen in his own country. It wasn't fair. But then, Jacob had learned a long time ago that life wasn't fair. Jacob closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. He wasn't going to let Victoria ruin this for him. He was almost home. Soon he would be with his family, and all of this would be behind him. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Every few minutes, Jacob could hear Victoria's frustrated sighs or the impatient tapping of her nails on the armrest. He had thought the situation was over, but clearly, Victoria wasn't done. Jacob glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, watching as she shifted in her seat, clearly agitated. Her frustration was almost palpable, radiating off her in waves. It was as if the very idea of sitting next to him, of sharing the same space, was too much for her to handle. Finally, Victoria could no longer contain her frustration. She turned toward Jacob, her voice sharp and cutting. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "And this is first class, after all." Jacob's eyes flicked toward her briefly before returning to the window. He wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but it was clear that Victoria wasn't going to let it go. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sure." Victoria scoffed, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over once more. "I don't know how you managed to get that seat," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "There must have been some kind of mix-up." Jacob clenched his jaw, feeling the tension build in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on them, watching the scene unfold. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be the center of attention, but Victoria was pushing him to the edge. "I didn't make a mistake," Jacob said, keeping his voice steady. "I bought this ticket." Victoria crossed her arms, her expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance. "You bought a first-class ticket?" she asked, her tone incredulous. "I find that hard to believe." Jacob took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew what she was implying, even if she hadn't come right out and said it. It was there, hanging in the air between them, thick with racial undertones. She didn't believe he belonged in first class because of the color of his skin. It was as simple as that. "Believe what you want," Jacob said quietly, his patience wearing thin. "But this is my seat." Victoria huffed, clearly unsatisfied with his answer. She turned toward the aisle, waving down a flight attendant with exaggerated urgency. "I need you to check this man's ticket," Victoria demanded as soon as the flight attendant approached, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "There's been some sort of mistake. He doesn't belong in first class." Michael Carter, a businessman and the CEO of a nonprofit organization, had been watching the scene unfold from a few rows behind. He had boarded the plane shortly after Jacob and Victoria, quietly taking his seat and blending into the background. But it hadn't taken long for him to notice the tension brewing between the two passengers ahead of him. Michael had seen people like Victoria before, people who wore their entitlement like a badge of honor, who believed that their wealth or status made them superior to others. It was a mindset he despised, one he had spent years fighting against in his work. Michael's organization, Carter Outreach, was dedicated to helping veterans and minority entrepreneurs. It was his way of giving back, of using his success to make a difference. But moments like this reminded him just how far society still had to go. He had wanted to step in, to say something that would shut Victoria down and offer Jacob the support he deserved. But something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the way Jacob had handled the situation. Calm, composed, with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Michael had recognized that kind of restraint, The kind that came from years of learning how to navigate a world where you were often judged before you even opened your mouth. So Michael had chosen to remain silent, for now. But as the confrontation between Jacob and Victoria continued to escalate, he found himself growing more and more disgusted by Victoria's behavior. It was clear that Jacob didn't deserve this kind of treatment. No one did. And Michael knew that when the time was right, he would find a way to help. For now, he would watch and wait, letting Jacob handle the situation in his own way. As the plane touched down and began to taxi toward the gate, Jacob felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had been running on fumes since he left his last deployment, and now all he wanted was to see Grace and Chloe, to sink into the comfort of home. But his mind kept drifting back to the incident with Victoria. Her blatant disrespect still lingered like a bad aftertaste, despite the calm demeanor he had worked so hard to maintain. Passengers began gathering their belongings, and Jacob stood to retrieve his duffel from the overhead bin. As he did, he felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a tall man standing behind him, offering a friendly, calm smile. "Excuse me, you're Jacob Turner, right?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Michael Carter. I was sitting a few rows back and, well, I saw what happened." Jacob raised an eyebrow but shook the man's hand. Michael's grip was firm, his demeanor confident yet respectful. "I just wanted to say you handled yourself with a lot of dignity back there," Michael continued. "I've seen situations like that escalate in ways that never end well, but you stayed calm. That says a lot about your character." Jacob felt a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. He wasn't one to seek out praise for doing the right thing, but something about Michael's tone caught his attention. "I appreciate that," Jacob said quietly, nodding. "It's not the first time I've dealt with someone like her. But it is what it is." Michael chuckled, but his eyes remained serious. "Well, not everyone could handle it like you did, and that's why I'd like to talk to you about something." Jacob slung his duffel over his shoulder, now curious. "About what exactly?" Michael stepped aside, letting a few passengers pass before continuing. "I run a nonprofit organization that helps veterans transition back into civilian life. We also support minority-owned businesses with grants and mentorship. After watching how you managed yourself on that flight, I think you'd be a great fit to help us with some leadership roles. You clearly have the kind of patience and resilience we need." Jacob blinked in surprise. He hadn't been expecting this. A random encounter turning into a job offer. "Leadership roles?" he echoed, skepticism creeping into his voice. Michael nodded, his smile widening. "I think you'd be great. I understand if you're not ready to jump back into something right away, but if you're even a little interested, we could use someone like you." Jacob hesitated. After years of service, he had been looking forward to spending more time with his family, focusing on Chloe's milestones and catching up on the time he had missed. But Michael's offer intrigued him. He had always wanted to do something beyond the military, something that would continue to give him a sense of purpose. Could this be that opportunity? "I don't know," Jacob said, his tone cautious. "I've been planning to take a break, spend some time with my family, but maybe." Michael nodded in understanding, not pushing too hard. "I get that. You've earned the time with your family. But listen, if you're interested, why don't you come by our office sometime next week? No pressure, just a conversation. I'll give you the address." Jacob looked at Michael's outstretched hand, where a small business card now rested. After a brief moment of contemplation, he accepted the card. "All right," Jacob said, pocketing the card. "I'll think about it." Michael's smile deepened, and he clapped Jacob on the shoulder. "Take your time, Jacob. You've already done more than most people ever will. But if you want to keep making a difference, I think you'll like what we're doing." Jacob stepped off the plane, the familiar sounds and smells of the airport surrounding him like a warm, albeit chaotic blanket. But despite the relief of finally being back on U.S. soil, his mind was occupied with Michael's offer. It had been completely unexpected, and while part of him wanted to brush it off as just another random encounter, something about it tugged at him. As he made his way through the terminal, he spotted Grace and Chloe waiting for him near the exit. His heart swelled at the sight of them, and for the first time since he boarded the flight, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. "Daddy!" Chloe's voice rang out as she sprinted toward him, her arms wide open. Jacob dropped his duffel to the ground just in time to scoop her up into a hug, the weight of her small body grounding him in the present. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "I missed you." Grace followed behind Chloe, her smile wide and full of warmth. She embraced him next, her arms wrapped around his waist as she rested her head against his chest. "Welcome home," she murmured. Jacob pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. This was what he had been fighting for, what he had longed to return to. And yet Michael's offer still lingered in the back of his mind. Later that evening, after Chloe had been tucked into bed, Jacob sat at the kitchen table with Grace, the two of them sipping tea in comfortable silence. It was a ritual they had adopted during his deployments, late-night talks, where they caught up on everything they had missed while he was away. Jacob stared down at the business card Michael had given him, running his thumb along its edges. Grace noticed his distraction and raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. Jacob sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I met someone on the flight today," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Michael Carter. He runs a nonprofit that helps veterans and minority businesses. He offered me a leadership role." Grace tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "A leadership role? Doing what?" "Mentorship mostly," Jacob replied. "Helping veterans transition back into civilian life. Working with minority-owned businesses. It sounds like something I could really get behind, but..." He trailed off, unsure of how to articulate his uncertainty. "But you're not sure if you're ready to dive back into work," Grace finished for him, her tone understanding. Jacob nodded. "Exactly. I want to be here, with you and Chloe. I've missed so much already. But at the same time, this could be an opportunity to make a real difference." Grace was quiet for a moment, considering his words. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand why you're torn, and I would love to have you here with us every day, but I also know you, Jacob. You've always needed a sense of purpose. You've always wanted to help people. This sounds like something that could give you that." Jacob stared down at their joined hands, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Grace was right. He had always thrived on having a mission, something bigger than himself to work toward. But was he ready to jump into something new so soon? "I'll think about it," Jacob said finally, his voice quiet. Grace smiled, her eyes full of love and understanding. "Whatever you decide, I'm here to support you." A week later, Jacob found himself standing outside of Michael Carter's office building, his stomach twisting with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He hadn't made the decision lightly, but after talking it over with Grace and spending more time reflecting on his own desires, he had come to a conclusion. He wasn't done making a difference. Jacob walked through the glass doors and approached the receptionist, who directed him to the third floor. When he arrived at the office suite, Michael was waiting for him just outside the conference room, his familiar easygoing smile in place. "Jacob?" Michael greeted warmly, extending his hand. "I'm glad you came." Jacob shook his hand, nodding. "I wasn't sure at first," he admitted, "but I think I'm ready to see what this is all about." Michael led him into the conference room, where a few other team members were already seated. They exchanged greetings, and Jacob quickly realized he was among people who shared his values and understood his experiences. The room was full of former service members and minority entrepreneurs, all working together to create positive change. As the meeting progressed, Jacob felt a growing sense of belonging. They discussed mentorship programs for veterans, grants for minority-owned businesses, and initiatives to address systemic inequalities. Jacob listened intently, offering his own insights when appropriate. By the end of the meeting, he knew he had made the right decision. Michael pulled him aside afterward, clapping him on the shoulder. "What do you think? Ready to dive in?" Jacob smiled, feeling more confident than he had in a long time. He said, his voice firm. "I'm in." The work was challenging, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Over the next few weeks, Jacob took on a leadership role in the organization, mentoring veterans who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. He shared his own experiences, helping them navigate the challenges that came with transitioning from the military to the civilian world. He also worked closely with minority-owned businesses, offering guidance and support as they tried to grow and expand. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt like he was truly making a difference, not just in the lives of others, but in his own life as well. While Jacob was adjusting to his new role at Carter Outreach, the consequences of the confrontation on the plane were unfolding in ways he hadn't anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, one of the other passengers had recorded the entire exchange between him and Victoria on their phone. A few days later, the video was uploaded to social media, where it quickly went viral. The video captured everything: Victoria's condescending comments, her questioning of Jacob's right to sit in first class, and Jacob's calm, dignified response. Within hours, it had garnered thousands of views, and within a day, it had been shared millions of times. Hashtags like Wacth first class, racism, and dignity in action began trending, with people all over the country praising Jacob for his restraint and criticizing Victoria for her entitled behavior. The video sparked heated debates about race, privilege, and the everyday discrimination that people of color still faced, even in 2024. Jacob's phone began blowing up with messages from friends, family, and strangers alike. Everyone had seen the video, and everyone had something to say about it. "You handled that better than I ever could," one of his military buddies texted. "You're an inspiration," read another message from a stranger. Jacob was overwhelmed by the attention. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, and now, without his consent, his private confrontation had become a public spectacle. Part of him felt violated, as though his dignity had been put on display for the world to judge. But another part of him recognized the power of the moment. The video was shining a light on a reality that far too many people still chose to ignore. But while Jacob's star was rising, Victoria was facing the fallout of her actions. Victoria Hayes had no idea that the encounter on the plane had been recorded. She went about her life, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. But that all changed when she arrived at work one morning to find her phone buzzing with notifications, text messages, emails, and social media alerts. At first, she didn't understand why she was suddenly the center of attention. But then she saw the video. Her heart dropped as she watched herself on screen, her words dripping with entitlement and condescension. She could see the anger in Jacob's eyes, the restraint he had shown in the face of her blatant disrespect. The video had gone viral, and now the whole world was watching her and judging her. Within hours, her employer had called an emergency meeting. The marketing firm where she worked was facing immense pressure from the public to take action. The company's CEO, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Bennett, sat across from Victoria in a tense meeting. "This behavior is unacceptable," Sarah said, her voice cold. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Effective immediately, you are no longer employed by this company." Victoria was blindsided. "But there's no but, Victoria. This is a PR nightmare. Our brand cannot be associated with someone who behaves like this." Victoria left the meeting in a daze, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. In less than 24 hours, she had lost her job, her reputation, and her sense of security, all because of one stupid moment on a plane. For the first time in her life, Victoria was forced to confront her own privilege. She had always assumed that her wealth and status would protect her from the consequences of her actions. But now she is facing the harsh reality that no one was immune from accountability. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Victoria reached out to Michael Carter, hoping for a chance to make amends. Victoria Hayes sat in her small apartment, the weight of her recent downfall pressing down on her. Everything had happened so quickly. One moment, she was a successful businesswoman with a spotless reputation, and the next she was jobless, ostracized, and the subject of nationwide scorn, all because of a single moment on an airplane, a moment she hadn't even realized would change her life forever. The internet was unforgiving. Social media had branded her a symbol of entitled racism, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the viral video of her confrontation with Jacob Turner. It was everywhere in the news and online forums, and even in her inbox where strangers sent her hateful messages, condemning her for her actions. Victoria had tried to defend herself at first. She told herself it had all been a misunderstanding, that she hadn't meant anything by her words. But the more she watched the video, the more she realized the truth. She had been arrogant, she had been prejudiced, and now she was paying the price. Desperate for a way to fix things, Victoria reached out to Michael Carter. The man she had learned was connected to Jacob. She knew it was a long shot, but she hoped that somehow Michael could help her make amends. A few days later, Victoria found herself sitting across from Michael in his office. feeling small and insignificant for the first time in her life. Michael was polite but distant, clearly wary of her intentions. He had seen the video, of course, and he wasn't sure if she was here for the right reasons or just trying to save face. "Thank you for meeting with me," Victoria said, her voice quiet. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unsure of how to begin. I don't know how to fix this." Michael studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why do you want to fix it?" he asked. "Because you lost your job? Because your reputation was a hit? Or because you genuinely realized that what you did was wrong?" Victoria's throat tightened. She had asked herself the same question over and over again in the days since the video went viral. And at first, her motives had been selfish. She wanted to repair her image, to get her life back. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was bigger than her. What she had done on that plane had hurt someone. It had exposed her own biases in a way she couldn't ignore. "I was wrong," Victoria admitted, her voice trembling. "I treated Jacob like he didn't belong, like he wasn't worthy of the same respect as anyone else in that first-class cabin. And I realize now that I've been doing that my whole life, to people I don't even know, without even thinking about it. I need to make this right." Michael nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair as he considered her words. He wasn't convinced yet, but he could see that Victoria was genuinely struggling with her guilt. "Making it right won't be easy," he said. "You can't undo what's been done, but you can learn from it. You can grow." Victoria looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I want to," she said softly. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Michael was quiet for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "There's one person who deserves your apology more than anyone else," he said. "Jacob Turner. You hurt him in ways you probably don't even understand. If you're serious about making amends, you need to start with him." Victoria's heart sank at the thought of facing Jacob again. The last time they had spoken, she had been full of arrogance and entitlement. She wasn't sure if she could handle seeing him again, knowing how much damage she had caused. But Michael was right. If she truly wanted to change, she needed to start with the person she had wronged. "I'll do it," Victoria said, her voice steady. "I'll apologize to him." A few days later, Jacob sat in the same conference room where he had first met Michael, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He had been told that Victoria wanted to meet with him, to apologize for what had happened on the plane. At first, he had been hesitant. What could she possibly say to make up for the way she had treated him? But after speaking with Grace and reflecting on his own values, Jacob had agreed to the meeting. He believed in second chances in the power of redemption. And if Victoria was truly sorry for her actions, then just maybe this could be an opportunity for both of them to grow. The door to the conference room opened, and Victoria stepped inside. She looked different than Jacob remembered. Gone was the air of superiority and entitlement. In its place was a woman who seemed fragile, unsure of herself, and burdened by guilt. She glanced nervously at Jacob before sitting down across from him, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Victoria began, her voice soft. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet Jacob's gaze. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to say this." Jacob remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I was wrong," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "The way I treated you on that plane, it was unacceptable. I was arrogant, entitled, and prejudiced. I assumed things about you based on your appearance. And that's something I've done my whole life without even realizing it. I'm so sorry." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for Jacob's response, her stomach twisting with nerves. She had spent the past few days preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she could handle it. Jacob leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "What do you want from me, Victoria?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Do you want me to forgive you? Do you want me to tell you that everything's fine now, and we can both move on like nothing happened?" Victoria's throat tightened, and she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I need you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better. I want to learn from this, to make sure I never treat anyone that way again." Jacob studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had spent years in the military, learning how to read people, how to see through their words to the truth beneath. And as he looked at Victoria now, he saw something he hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. She wasn't just saying the right words to save face. She truly wanted to change. "You have a long way to go," Jacob said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "But if you're serious about wanting to change, I'm willing to give you a chance. Not because I owe you anything, but because I believe in redemption. Everyone deserves the opportunity to be better." Victoria blinked back tears, her chest tight with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise, I won't waste this chance." Jacob nodded, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't going to be easy," he warned. "You're going to have to face some hard truths about yourself, about the way you've lived your life. But if you're willing to do the work, I'm willing to help." Victoria took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since the video had gone viral, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but she knew that with Jacob's guidance, she had a chance to become the person she had always pretended to be. Over the next few months, Victoria threw herself into the work. Under Jacob's mentorship, she attended workshops on diversity and inclusion, read books on systemic racism and unconscious bias, and participated in difficult conversations with people from all walks of life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she wanted to quit, moments when the weight of her past actions felt too heavy to bear. But she pushed through, determined to prove that she could change. Jacob was patient but firm, guiding her through the process with a steady hand. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, and he made sure that Victoria understood that this was a lifelong journey, not a quick fix. As they worked together, Jacob began to see glimpses of the person Victoria could become. Someone who was compassionate, empathetic, and willing to confront her own flaws. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but there was progress. And that was enough for now. One day, as they sat in the conference room after a particularly intense discussion on privilege, Victoria turned to Jacob with a hesitant smile. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I did to you," she said quietly, "but I'm grateful for this chance. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and I'll never forget that." Jacob looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're not helping me," he said. "You're helping yourself, and that's what matters." Victoria nodded, her heart full of gratitude. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path. As the months passed, Jacob and Victoria continued to work together. Their unlikely partnership grew into something more than either of them had anticipated. The viral video that had once symbolized Victoria's downfall had become a turning point for both of them. Jacob, now a symbol of dignity and resilience, and Victoria, a reminder that redemption was always possible, even for those who had made the worst mistakes. Their story began to attract attention from media outlets and organizations interested in their journey of reconciliation. They were invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events, sharing their story with audiences eager to learn from their experience. At one such event, held at a prestigious university, Jacob and Victoria stood on stage together, facing an auditorium full of students, professors, and community leaders. The tension in the air was palpable as they prepared to tell their story once again. Victoria spoke first, her voice steady despite her nerves. "A year ago, I was a different person," she began. "I thought I was open-minded, that I treated everyone equally. But one moment on a plane showed me the truth. I was prejudiced, I was entitled, and I hurt someone because of it." The audience listened in rapt silence as Victoria recounted the events of the plane ride, her voice filled with regret. She spoke about the viral video, the fallout, and the long, difficult journey she had embarked on to become a better person. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before Jacob took the microphone. "What happened on that plane was painful," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But it led to something powerful. It showed that even in our darkest moments, there is potential for growth and redemption. Victoria made a mistake, but she's doing the work to make things right, and that's something we can all learn from." As they finished their presentation, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of applause that came from a simple acknowledgement of a job well done. It was a standing ovation, a show of support for two people who had taken a moment of conflict and turned it into an opportunity for change. In the months that followed, Jacob and Victoria continued their work, using their story to inspire others to confront their own biases and work toward a more inclusive society. Their partnership wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of tension, moments where the past threatened to resurface. But they had learned how to navigate those difficulties with honesty and empathy. Victoria had come a long way from the woman she had once been, but she knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to grow, and with Jacob's guidance, she was determined to keep moving forward. As for Jacob, he had found a new sense of purpose in his work with Carter Outreach. He had always believed in the power of redemption, and now he was living proof that even the most difficult moments could lead to something better. Together they had turned a moment of prejudice and hurt into a story of hope and healing, a reminder that no matter how far we fall, there is always a way to rise again. Jacob Turner never expected that a single plane ride could change his life so profoundly. What had started as a painful encounter filled with disrespect had transformed into a movement of reconciliation and growth, with him and Victoria Hayes at its center. As the months passed, their story spread beyond corporate offices and conferences, touching communities across the country. The viral video that once showcased an ugly moment of entitlement evolved into something more like a story of forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of change. Media outlets continued to cover their journey, intrigued by the unlikely partnership between the soldier and the businesswoman. Jacob and Victoria received countless invitations to speak at schools, colleges, and diversity and inclusion panels. Their message was clear. Everyone, no matter their background or past mistakes, had the capacity to grow and make a difference. One afternoon, as Jacob sat in his office at Carter Outreach, he reflected on the past year. It had been a whirlwind, but in the best way possible. He had found a renewed sense of purpose, one that extended far beyond his military service. His work with veterans and minority entrepreneurs had grown exponentially, thanks in large part to the increased attention from their story. Jacob's phone buzzed with a message from Michael Carter. It was a simple text, but it brought a smile to Jacob's face. "Michael, you're a rock star, Jacob. Just finished reading another article about you and Victoria. The work we're doing wouldn't be the same without you." Jacob shook his head, amused by Michael's enthusiasm. But deep down, he knew the truth. This work was more than just his. It was the collective effort of everyone who had taken part in the organization's mission to make real, tangible change in the world. He glanced out the window of his office, watching the city buzz with life below. It wasn't lost on him how much had changed, not just for him, but for Victoria as well. Victoria Hayes had come a long way from the woman she had once been. In the years since the incident on the plane, she had faced some of the hardest truths of her life. At times, the journey felt unbearable, facing the consequences of her actions, acknowledging her biases, and accepting the fallout of her past decisions. But she hadn't given up. Instead, she had leaned into discomfort, determined to prove that she could be better. Her work with Jacob had not only changed her perspective, but it had also given her a newfound purpose. She was no longer content with simply regaining her reputation. She wanted to use her experience to help others see the same truths she had come to understand. Victoria began hosting workshops on accountability and unconscious bias, partnering with organizations across the country. She spoke openly about her experience, never sugarcoating her mistakes, and encouraging others to confront their own prejudices. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when she doubted herself, moments when she wondered if she was truly making a difference. But every time she saw the light of understanding in someone's eyes, she knew it was worth it. One day, after a particularly successful workshop at a local high school, a young girl approached Victoria. She was shy, her hands nervously twisting in front of her, but her eyes were full of curiosity. "Miss Hayes?" the girl asked, her voice soft. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria smiled warmly, nodding. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "How do you change? I mean, how do you really change when you've done something bad?" Victoria's heart ached at the question, knowing firsthand how difficult it was to transform. "Change is hard," she admitted. "It takes time, patience, and a lot of self-reflection. But the most important thing is to be willing to listen and learn. You have to be open to the possibility that you might not know everything. And that's okay. The key is to never stop trying." The girl nodded thoughtfully, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, before turning to walk away. As Victoria watched her go, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't about erasing her past. It was about learning from it and helping others avoid the same mistakes. One afternoon, Jacob and Victoria found themselves sitting across from each other in yet another boardroom, preparing for a major meeting. They had been invited to speak at a national conference on diversity, where corporate leaders from across the country had gathered to discuss the future of inclusion in the workplace. It was a big moment for both of them. Their story had already made waves, but this event had the potential to solidify their message on a larger scale. As they sat in the quiet before the event, Jacob turned to Victoria, a soft smile on his face. "You've come a long way," he said, his tone warm and sincere. "I'm proud of you." Victoria looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," she admitted. "You didn't have to help me. You could have walked away and let me figure it out on my own. But you didn't, and I'll never forget that." Jacob shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "You helped yourself, Victoria. I just pointed you in the right direction." The room began to fill with conference attendees, and the two of them stood up, preparing to take the stage. As they walked out in front of the packed audience, the weight of the moment settled over them. This was more than just a story about a plane ride gone wrong. It was a story about the power of forgiveness, growth, and the belief that people could change. The applause that greeted them was thunderous, but Jacob and Victoria remained calm and collected. This wasn't about them. It was about the message they carried. As they began their presentation, sharing their journey with the audience, they could feel the room's energy shift. People were listening. They were understanding. And that was all that mattered. Months passed and Jacob and Victoria continued their work, expanding the reach of their message to new audiences. Their story became a blueprint for how to navigate difficult conversations about race, privilege, and redemption. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of doubt, but they had learned how to lean into those challenges and emerge stronger. One evening, as they sat together after a long day of presentations, Victoria turned to Jacob, her expression serious. "Do you ever think about where we would be if that plane ride hadn't happened?" she asked quietly. Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "All the time," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Everything happens for a reason, and we're here now. That's what matters." Victoria nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I guess you're right. It's just strange to think about how one moment can change everything." "It can," Jacob agreed, "but it's not just the moment. It's what you do with it after that matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The world around them was still full of challenges, still full of the same biases and prejudices they had been fighting against. But they also knew that progress was possible. They had seen it in the people they had met, in the conversations they had sparked, and in the lives they had touched. As the night grew darker, they both felt a sense of peace. Their journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. Years later, Jacob and Victoria's story would continue to resonate with new generations of leaders, students, and activists. Their unlikely partnership had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even the most painful moments could lead to profound growth. Jacob expanded his work with Carter Outreach, helping countless veterans and minority entrepreneurs build successful futures. His leadership had transformed the organization into a national force for positive change, and his influence had reached far beyond the military and business communities. Victoria, too, had found her place in the world. She had become a sought-after speaker on topics of accountability, bias, and redemption. Her journey had inspired others to confront their own prejudices and work toward building a more inclusive society. And through it all, she never forgot the lessons she had learned from Jacob, the importance of listening, learning, and never giving up on the possibility of change. Their story, once a painful reminder of division, had become a testament to the power of unity. Together, they had proven that no matter how deep the divide, it was always possible to build bridges, to create understanding, and to leave the world better than they found it. As the years passed, the legacy of their partnership continued to grow, touching lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. They had turned a moment of conflict into a movement of hope, and for that, they would always be remembered. Decades later, a new generation would learn about Jacob Turner and Victoria Hayes in history books and documentaries. Their story had become a blueprint for how to navigate difficult conversations about race, privilege, and the human capacity for change. In classrooms across the country, students would watch the viral video that had once been the catalyst for their journey, studying the ways in which it had sparked a national conversation about bias and accountability. And as they did, they would be reminded of one simple truth. We all have the capacity to change. We all have the power to rise above our mistakes and make a difference. It's not about where we start, it's about where we go from here. As the final credits rolled on their documentary, a voiceover would echo their message for the ages. Even in our darkest moments, there is potential for growth and transformation. With empathy, education, and a willingness to change, we can overcome our biases and build bridges across the divides that separate us. Jacob and Victoria's story had come full circle. Their legacy was one of hope, unity, and the belief that no matter how far we fall, there is always a way to rise again. If this story moved you and you want to hear more powerful stories of resilience and redemption, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of hope and transformation. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring update.